Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. So this is our second webinar related to one of our newer courses, Rethinking Generalization with the Real Model, created by Brenda Terzic-Garland and Madi Ueda-Tao. So we had our first webinar on this topic in November of last year, and this was more of an introduction to the real model. But today's webinar is a bit more about how the real model can be used in a broader sense. So the topic of this webinar today is embracing vulnerability in the generality of parent training skills. And it's presented by Brenda Terzic-Garland and also co-presented by Madi Ueda-Tao. Brenda is the CEO and co-founder of Applied Behavior Consultants. And she's also the creator of The Real Model and the author of the new book, Real Model, Rethinking Generalization. And Madi is the Chief Clinical Officer at Applied Behavior Consultants, where she works closely with, or has worked closely with Brenda for over 16 years. And if we get a lot of questions, they may not be able to answer all of them. So if yours was not answered, or maybe you thought of a question after the webinar ends, you can email realmodel@appliedbehavior.com. And I'll send these in the chat, by the way. Brenda and Madi encourage you to reach out to them there. They're more than happy to chat with you and answer any questions you have. And if you have any questions related to your CEU for attending the webinar, or just more information about the course related to today, you can email us at pdteam@abatechnologies.com. And that is all I have for housekeeping items. So Brenda, I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
Okay.
You can go ahead and share your screen whenever you're ready, and let me know if you have any issues.
Okay. Everybody can see this, I presume?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar. And as Allison said, this is a broader area that you can use the real model with respect to parent training specifically. Okay, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. So the main emphasis that I wanted to make with respect to parent training, all of us who are practitioners in the field providing ABA treatment for children with autism, also for the most part have to include the parents in the aspects of the child's program at some point in time. So the focus of this particular webinar is how we can embrace vulnerability in the generality of parent training skills in order to make a meaningful connection with the parents. I want to give you a brief background about the real model itself, because as I go through this webinar, I'll be mainly talking about parent training initially with respect to vulnerability, and then I will tie it in with how you can utilize the real model in that process. So the real model in general provides practitioners with a systematic analysis on how the environment affects the child and how the child responds to the changing environment, with the specific ways that I delineated the structure of each of the levels of generalization with respect to analysis and behavior change. The treatment focus is to be able to utilize those principles that we've learned regarding behavior analysis in the process of teaching the child in a way that's it's a meaningful exchange. And one of the things that we're accused of often is that we're too robotic, or we're not able to take our behavioral jargon and present it in a way that really allows us to make that connection with staff that we're training or even parents that we're working with. So when I looked at generalization as a whole, one of the things I thought was really missing was how do behavior analysts avoid that train and hope situation. So in other words, do you provide the discrete trials training methodologies or training procedures to teach skills? And then we say to ourselves, well, they need to be able to generalize. And even though that's a common subject that has been written about conceptually, there really was a missing or there was a gap between the actual academic aspects of understanding generalization and how to go about implementing it in a way that we could not only continue to provide our analysis, but be able to put it in practice with the child and the staff who are training to implement those procedures and interventions. When we look at, well, how do people really interpret our field? We get a lot of credit for breaking down skills and teaching them in small units, enough to be able to see day-to-day changes in the child's behavior. But then the challenges become really noticeable when once the child has mastered certain skills and concepts, or even responses to those concepts, when it comes to maintaining what they've learned and generalizing it to other types of environments, settings, situations over time. The trap that we get into is that we typically have some type of curriculum that we're using. And what we want to avoid is being curriculum driven in order to really address generalization in a way that is meaningful to the parent and the child, that spreads across many environments, situations, settings, and activities. So I developed a five-level process to teach for generalization, in order to break down the vast aspects of the child's life that we're programming for. And basically, we're programming the child's life from the beginning, from the time he wakes up to the time that he goes to bed. And when we look at breaking everything down in terms of what it is that we need to teach regarding concepts related to language, self-care, and play, and building those repertoires back up so that the child can actually socialize with family peers and the verbal community, it's a lot of information to be able to organize, sort, and then on top of that, be able to explain to parents what we are actually doing in a way that they can track and follow what we have actually been providing for their child in a way that's useful to them and their family. So this is a slide that's also in the continuing ed training that I developed for ABA Technologies, that breaks down the levels of generalization that's user-friendly for parents to be able to see, or any new staff people that you are training, because there's so much information per level and it's a lot to take in all at one time. Basically, the real model doesn't work for the practitioner. More importantly, it allows you to do an ongoing behavior analytic analysis within a framework that is useful, friendly, and allows you to be informed by the scientific principles as you go about teaching for generalization. I will be spending the remaining time covering the real model and the process of generalizing parent training skills and how vulnerability impacts this process. So why did I pick vulnerability as the focus for this particular training? Well, it is a topic that is not talked about in behavior analysis, because when you look at the definition of vulnerability, basically it's our emotions and thoughts that occur when we're feeling vulnerable. And most of us as behavior analysts would refer to those as private events. So it isn't oftentimes that we talk about what we're thinking, feeling, and saying to ourselves, but it is something that is present all the time. Now, parents of children with autism experience these thoughts and emotions of vulnerability in ways that greatly impact the stress levels of the family, the way they interact with their child. And there are many, many studies out there or research indicating that parents of children with autism have higher levels of stress, family difficulties and challenges. But vulnerability is not really addressed from a practitioner standpoint, either in our academic courses or when we're doing our practicum. And I've been utilizing the work of Brene Brown with respect to vulnerability, because it was the first time I actually had read about vulnerability in a way that I believe that we could take that in and really address it from a place of compassion, wholeheartedness, and meaningful change. So when we look at vulnerability in general, again, these are emotions and thoughts that we're having on a continuous basis. They are present all the time. We're just not aware of it and we don't call it out. Parents feel vulnerable all the time, even with typical kids. We're always questioning, I myself as a parent, how our emotions relate to what we're actually doing with our child. Sometimes we take action, sometimes we don't. We continue to judge ourselves, but the vulnerability will impact the parent's experience with their child, and interactions in their own learning. And it exponentially is greater for parents of children with autism, because the bonding process is impacted. They want and are looking for a meaningful interaction with their child. So what I want all of you to do right now is write in the chat 3 words that describe what vulnerability is for a parent.
All right, so we'll do a little waterfall here. So exposed, intimate, difficult, weakness, scared, unknown, unsure, uncomfortable, raw, open, admitting, lack of knowledge, embarrassment, weakness, anxiety, stress, intimidation, hesitant, anxious, honesty, apprehension, judgment, fragile, admittance, critical, scared, fight or flight, vulnerable, acceptance.
Okay.
Transparency,
So
fearful.
a lot. Now it sounds like I won't have time to hear them all. I'm going to actually take all those and kind of sort them out. But it's clear that each of you recognize and acknowledge that that vulnerability does exist for parents. Now, the question to ask is, what do those thoughts and feelings look like if the parent isn't saying it out loud? So oftentimes we miss those opportunities to acknowledge that those vulnerabilities are actually present, because we're not tuned in to what it actually looks like when it's actually there all the time. So it could come across like this. One day, parent feels strong and ready to move forward, seeking out the help needed for their child. And on another day, they feel grief and heartbreak, wondering what went wrong. The vulnerability for parents can show up like this. She doesn't do this behavior just 2 hours a day or a few hours a day. She does it all day long. You can hear the stress, the exhaustion, the embarrassment from the parent just in their tone of voice when they say that. When a parent says, I address them when the tantrum goes on too long, because sometimes during this assessment, when we're actually interviewing parents and they're talking about the tantrum, we'll say, well, what do you end up doing if it's happening during a dressing situation? They go, we just dress them. We got things to do. The parent might also say, I just want my child to give me a hug and ask me for what he wants. I can't think of anything more heartbreaking than a parent not being able to connect with their child, be able to hug them, having the child reject them. That in itself, just making that statement, makes that parent vulnerable, embarrassed, wanting a connection, all the things that all of you had said. He doesn't look at me when I call his name. It's like I'm not there. All he wants to do is spin the bottle on the table. And again, I remember when the parent said this, she was crying. Now, crying, of course, could look like vulnerability, but there's also other things of shame and guilt. What did I do wrong? Those are all underlying themes. But we want to just be able to acknowledge that. I just want my child to be able to go to a birthday party. I want him to be able to play with his brother. I want to, I'm not going to be able, so here's a negative. I'm not going to be able to find the time to take the data or do a teaching session with my child. I'm just simply exhausted. But they're not going to oftentimes label the vulnerability feeling that they are having. They're simply going to make a statement. So it's in their tone of voice. It's the look on their face. A parent will do anything to have a connection with his or her child. However, when that connection attempt is punished and the child moves away, or the child starts screaming, or the child won't even look at the parent, the vulnerability begins to be a lot different than it would be for a typical parent. And now the parent saying, wow, I can't even be effective with my child. He can't even ask me a question or make a request. And that is really so much in the forefront that then you as a behavior analyst, listening, seeing, hearing these statements and thoughts being made by the parent, puts you in a vulnerable position. So what does that mean for you as a practitioner? Do we then look at or embrace our own vulnerability at the time that it is being experienced concurrent with what the parent is saying, doing, or feeling? So practitioners who provide this parent training and consultation for the child, your vulnerability is going to look a lot different. The difference is you're not asking yourself those questions, because you still then have to lean in and have the conversation about whatever it is that you have on your agenda to train the parent. And you also have to deal with why parents aren't able to do certain things that you assign to them. But based on how you respond to the parent's vulnerability and yours at the same time, will create a connection with the parent or will become a barrier. And it will either then strengthen or weaken your connection based on how you respond to your own vulnerability in the moment. So I don't know if practitioners are certainly, I'm going to say that most practitioners are not saying these thoughts and feelings out loud, but they usually go left unsaid. We usually dive right into our material, or we, more importantly, avoid even making any statements about what is going on because we're uncomfortable. And by ignoring those, so I want to make the distinction between ignoring your vulnerable feelings and thoughts that are going on as opposed to embracing them. In other words, if you look at vulnerability as thoughts and feelings that are always present and you embrace them, you then are in a position to be able to ask for help, to deliver services more wholeheartedly. Now, what happens is when those feelings and thoughts of vulnerability are going on, it's right in the midst of the parent expressing frustration with the data that you wanted them to take, and now you're just giving them 5 more suggestions on what the parent needs to do. It can also show up for you in ways like this: when you find yourself changing your schedule week to week rather than setting reasonable boundaries, because that conversation of leaning in and setting those boundaries with the parents that you work with, or with your supervisor because you have too many cases, or whatever the workload is. We would prefer just to numb those vulnerable feelings that are coming up, and we will just change our schedule because it's easier. When accountability is on the forefront, either by feedback you receive by a parent or supervisor, we weren't trained to give feedback and we weren't trained to receive feedback. So oftentimes that will bring about vulnerable feelings for you. When you have to hold people accountable that you train with staff, with parents, that will bring vulnerability in terms of what you do as a practitioner. When you find it easier to correct somebody's report rather than teaching the skills that are necessary to actually write the report, you just find yourself doing it yourself. And last, which is very common, when you're gossiping or complaining to others because you can't find a solution or you're not willing to put in the effort. So based off of how I demonstrated how vulnerability can show up for you as a practitioner, I want you now to write down 3 words that describe vulnerability as a practicing behavior analyst.
Overwhelmed, nervous, insecure, having the answers, not feeling accepted, closed-minded, having the tools, opportunity to connect, growth, imposter syndrome, overwhelmed, insecure, honesty, frustration, workload, lack of resources, raw, exposed, anxious, nervous, insecure, afraid, judged, wasting time, outsider, catalyst for change, teaching new things, frustration, lack of resources, untrustworthy, overwhelmed, fear of failure, fear, overwhelmed, insecure.
So that's a lot. I have felt all those things. I'm a practicing practitioner as well. I've seen or felt many of those things in those types of situations, whether you're working with the child, staff, or with the parents. So what does it really mean to embrace vulnerability? So I'm going to to bring a little bit of ACT in as well. So you may be asking yourself, what does that have anything to do with generalizing parent training skills? What does vulnerability have anything to do with the real model? What is she talking about? Vulnerability has come up in parent training sessions, but I really don't want to really stop to think about and how it impacts the parent or myself by acknowledging it exists. Now, we numb out or we want to stop it because all the words that you just used to describe your vulnerability, this is all happening at the same time the parent is feeling vulnerable, that staff are feeling vulnerable, and now here you are working with the child who's in the midst of a behavior problem, or you're in the midst of doing your parent education training. So when I say we want to embrace that, as opposed to ignoring that it even exists, or cutting it off, or finding a different way that you can distract yourself from the vulnerability, means that you accept that it is happening. And because all these things happen sort of simultaneously, it's difficult to really begin to say, well, what does she mean by embracing vulnerability? You're just going to feel uncomfortable. And guess what? That's okay. If you are stressed out, if you feel helpless, that's okay, because none of those thoughts and feelings are forever. Vulnerability as emotion and as a thought can fluctuate. It's going to be high at certain times and low at other times. Sometimes it'll be vulnerability that didn't even have anything to do with the actual interaction you're having with the parent or staff, but it triggered something with you that happened a long time ago. Whatever it is, just acknowledge it, accept it, and stay in the present moment with what is happening with you, the parent, the child, the staff person that you're working with. Every time you acknowledge it and allow yourself to embrace it, then you're able to work with those feelings and thoughts much better. So let's say now you're in the midst of working with a parent who's had, the day was going really well, but then the day that you're supposed to show up for a parent training session, the babysitter called in sick, and now the parent is in a whirlwind. Their survival mode kicks in. Everything they planned to take care of themselves was canceled. They had to reschedule meetings, and here you are. And now, oh my God, I have an appointment with my behavior analyst to be able to go over some parent share material, and I didn't get the things done that I needed to. The parent looks completely exacerbated and feeling extremely vulnerable. Whoops, sorry. Okay. Another situation is the treatment recommendations are not what the parent expected. You just got done doing your evaluation and assessment on their 2-year-old child. You're recommending 40 hours a week. The parent's going, holy crap, I'm not going to do 40 hours of intervention. When am I going to have time to do that? I only want to do 10. You're feeling vulnerable and unacknowledged, and thought that you were clear with the parent on why 40 hours was important throughout the intervention and assessment, and explain to the parent what they are going to get into when you talk about ABA treatment at a high intensity level. And now you're feeling vulnerable, and you're wanting to really be able to see what the parent is saying, because they're feeling guilt that they're not able to be with their child in the way that a parent would with a typical child. They just want to be able to play with their kid, hug their kid, let their child just be a kid. And now you want them to go into a 40-hour-a-week intervention. What the heck does that look like? So recommending treatment needs to fade, or I'm sorry, what does that look like? And now you got to lean in and you got to have that conversation in a way that's wholehearted and meaningful. It can also happen when you're recommending treatment needs to fade and the treatment that's happening, and the parent's vulnerability is extremely high. They can't even imagine what their life is going to look like when you're no longer there, or the tutors are no longer there. You spent with the same parent, convincing them in a way that could be justified through your analysis that the child did need 40 hours. They got used to that, and now you're fading services after a year or two. So what do? We help the parent to acknowledge those vulnerable feelings and thought. Seems like you're having a tough day. Now, as arbitrary as that sounds and unmeaningful, the fact that they're just being acknowledged for what they're feeling that day doesn't require a lot of words. What you are saying is, it's okay. I'm not asking you to go into a therapy session with them, because that's not what we do. But we do need to be able to have compassion and empathy, and acknowledging and accepting what is happening with the parent will assist you in a way to diffuse your vulnerability and stay in the present moment with the parent. If you make it all about you, it's hard to accept what is happening and to be there for the parent when they're feeling like a failure, because in turn you feel like a failure. Like, what did I do wrong? So we want to embrace what is going on by being okay with that uncomfortable feel, those uncomfortable feelings and thoughts, and not also then feel like a failure, because what's happening to the parents is their failure brings out the judgment jury. And, oh my God, I'm not doing this right. What should I have done? I should have done this. And all the shouldas, would'ves, whatever. They get into what we call a shame and blame situation is, well, now I'm feeling judged, and you're not even saying one thing to them. It could be just in the way that you interact with them. And when you acknowledge that those vulnerable feelings are going on, you're giving them permission to fall down and get back up. Just like kids fall down and they're very resilient, they get back up and they go to the next thing that they're going to who they're going to go play with. If they come down the slide and they fall down, they get back up. And we need to get the parents back up to empower them. Falling down means you try again. It's not failure. When you fall down and you try again, you learn and you get it right, as opposed to being the perfect parent. The generality of parent training skills requires change, including learning how to take care of yourself, moving away from blame and shame. So these are a lot of words that we're not used to using in our repertoire as behavior analysts, but they do exist. So the next question to answer is, what does generalization and vulnerability even have anything to do with each other in parent training? We facilitate the process as practitioners in embracing invulnerability and working through it, not getting rid of it. The parents are excited and vulnerable at the start of ABA services. So what you want to really look at is vulnerability is high because they've never had that before. It doesn't matter if they're bringing their child to the center or in the home. We've described it to them, but to actually put that in action, we know that that looks completely different. Progress with the child as a parent at the beginning, especially when we're establishing stimulus control and we're breaking those skills down to small manageable steps. The actual acquisition is apparent to the parent, and they are excited that the child is actually making success. They'll see changes in the behavior problems with respect to them decreasing. But then when we move from a more structured training setting to the natural environment, the anxiety for the parent goes back up. Or when the vulnerability of all those emotions that they were feeling in the beginning goes back up. It also occurs when we're entering into the transition of the last phase of ABA treatment. So what you want to be able to do as all these thoughts and feelings of vulnerability are coming up in the various phases of ABA treatment is you want to be able to identify and embrace their own thoughts and feelings when feeling vulnerable to provide parent training. In other words, you're going to embrace what's going on with them and you're going to embrace what is going on with you. The reason why that is crucial is that in order to provide parent training effectively, you want to make a connection with the parent. You want to embrace vulnerability when it shows up, and you want to be able to courageously work through those uncomfortable moments and have those conversations that need to happen. You don't decide as a practitioner, well, I'm not going to talk to the parent now about the importance of the data taking. I'm going to find out what I'm competing with and finding ways that they can be successful. So one might be asking, Change is hard, and we're taught how to embrace those emotion thoughts in a way that can develop. So not only are you as a practitioner, by embracing that vulnerability, you bring out your own strengths, but you also bring out the parent's strengths at the same time. When we look at generality as a whole with respect to parent training, in the same way that we look at generality for children, for the children that we teach the various skills and concepts and language skills, we also have to then look at the generalization of the parent training skills that we are providing for the parent. Now, this becomes a path for new learning exposure to new experiences, not only for the child, but for the parent. What I've provided for you in the next few slides is a way to capture from a big picture perspective what actually is occurring when it comes to generality of the child's skills and how the parent's participation in generalizing their parent training skills can actually make your program as a whole more effective. Generality can best be described as an active process of training and learning and being able to adapt the positive meaning to parent-child interactions. So how do you go about then facilitating this active process? So I decided to make an acronym out of the word generality of parent training skills. This is going to be made available to you by PDF, and I just want to go through each of what I call the generality of parent training skills inventory. G, genuine connection is made with the parent. E, you want to empower the parents is the focus. N is you want needed skills and communication are incorporated in family and social interactions. E, everyday successes are identified and reinforced. That becomes really crucial with respect to building trust with the parent and the parent being able to build trust with their child. You want to encourage regular breaks are taken for the parent to relax. Remember, they forget the reason why they're so vulnerable and so exhausted and embarrassed is because they forgot to take any time off for themselves. Everybody needs to be able to have that time, including yourself as a behavior analyst. We want to adapt the principles to new situations and skills and behavior problems that the parent is having in the home and not always make it specific to the structure intervention that we are teaching. Parent training, generality occurs not only in structured teaching, but also outside of structured teaching. Learning occurs in natural environments representative of their daily routines, not things that you're just going to make up for the parent. We want to incorporate their values. What do they value about their life, about their family, about their child, so that it navigates them rather than the vulnerability and feelings that they're having as being a barrier to those types of values. We want to be able to encourage talking from a problem-solving perspective, and we want to be able to create an interactive discussion regarding treatment outcomes. I put yearly because I used Y as my last acronym, but you can have these talks certainly more often. Many times when I've talked to parents who've had treatment in the past, no one ever actually sat down with them, interactively discussed the child's treatment goals and how they were met in a way that for them was useful and right. So after talking about vulnerability, generalization, parent training, you as a behavior analyst practitioner, where do you begin? There are many aspects to a child's ABA program. And again, it is extremely overwhelming when I say you are programming for every aspect of that child's life from the beginning, from the time they wake up to the time that they go to bed. When people used to ask me, what do you do for a living? Well, I work with children with autism and providing ABA treatment. And they said, what does that mean? And I said, well, do you have 5 hours so I can explain that to you? It is overwhelming when you begin to look at what it is that you actually do, which is one of the reasons why I wrote the Real Model book and the continuing ed course through ABA Technologies, is I wanted to break down what it really looks like to be a behavior analyst practitioner and providing ABA treatment in the lives of parents of children with autism in a way that was useful to you and could provide meaningful changes as you go about training staff, teaching children, and working with parents. ABA programs can be affected and accelerate learning in a way that actually from the beginning of intervention and throughout intervention, if we can identify the expected generalized behaviors along the way, and or even at the beginning, is where I say in the assessment part. However, determining the range of behaviors to generalize in the natural environment requires an analysis of those contexts. But how do we do that in a way where we haven't even actually started the ABA program? We want to look at generality of the behavior on a continuum, which I will go over briefly here. Not every single skill, behavior, concept that you teach a child will require high levels of generality. You'll have certain skills that require low generality, and you'll have certain skills that will require high generality. I have now taken this continuum and have broken it up into the different levels of generalization. This is what this real model looks like when we're explaining the 5 different levels of generalization with respect to how we would go about implementing parent training with the parents, and how they will be then interacting with their child, utilizing the various levels of generalization in order to impact change with their child. So I don't have time to go over each aspect of these levels, but what I want you to note is that I go over each of these levels specifically in the continuing ed course, of course, in the book, and this is the parent version, which is not in the book, and it's not in the continuing ed course. I created it for this specific webinar, but you'll see a tremendous amount of overlap. But what I want to provide for you so that you walk away with at least something useful, I want to give you one example. The example is on good manners. Now, as basic as that sounds, good manners is something that all children are expected to have in our society. And when you think about a child not being able to eat his food independently, it doesn't just involve learning how to use utensils, picking up the food, eating one bite at a time. It also involves using your napkin, staying seated, acknowledging people when they talk to you, looking at the person when they call your name, being able to meet someone else's man when they want more of something else. There's many things that we do during mealtime, but we don't say, you need to show good manners. What we'll say is, keep your fingers out of your food. Use your fork. These are all instructions that parents give on an ongoing basis, but the overall breadth of that is that they want their child to be accepted and belong. And if the child is not doing the same things that other kids are doing, then that's when parents' vulnerability is high. And because now they're comparing their child to what other kids do. And maybe other kids are being rude. Who knows? No parent can really see that. They're just seeing what their kid's doing. So we want to spend the time being able to teach these good manners during the course of while we're also teaching the child how to eat with a fork, how to eat with a spoon, how to be able to drink from a cup. Those are all skills that are taught independent, but at some point, we're also going to teach them how to use a napkin and to be able to switch between using a fork and a spoon. These are all built in because societal norms expect it. Now, I want to be really clear that I'm not expecting them to produce robots to have all children be exactly the same, but we want to create a space where kids can be accepted in society in a way that is belonging rather than being separate of everyone else. Then what I want to be able to describe from that perspective, good manners, is how does that actually look when we go to break it down? This isn't everything and all things. This is just relevant to this specific example. I pulled this from the case profile that I wrote in the book and limited it to what was appropriate for this talk. So if we are teaching a child to say please and thank you at mealtime, the child may need to know these various concepts: person ID, actions, pronouns, functions, cause and effect, commenting, requesting, rejecting, affirming, protesting, all what we consider to be MANs, WH questions. each of these areas each of these concepts or verbal operants that I have specified here must be taught at a level that's age appropriate or developmentally appropriate. The manding aspect of a child's repertoire is vast. It's actually so important, so critical that it's a verbal operant that I require all my staff to teach across the levels of generalization, ongoing from the beginning of intervention to the end. That's important, how important that repertoire is. And so is the listener repertoire. The generality of parent training skills then for demanding becomes very, very high for the child, because we want the child to be able to get his needs and wants met in all kinds of different environments, across different people, in various situations, and during social activities, when they're interacting with family and friends out in the community, when they're in a restaurant. There's usually not one situation where there is some demand going on or required of the child. When we go then to plan for generalized behavior change, and we want to be able to embrace the parent's vulnerability in that process of beginning treatment, it's helpful to show the big picture of what ABA treatment actually looks like, so the parent has an idea visually the direction of how their child's program is going to proceed. So I've pulled from the book again an example of what I call the daily life matrix, which comes from the real matrices that is created and developed during the assessment process. And what I did is I highlighted the activity breakfast, which is where the child needs to be able to show good manners during mealtime in general, but I just took one aspect of this particular matrix. The reason why I put it in the matrix of the morning routine is I wanted you to see, the parent gets an idea about how taking this one individual skill and the communication that is involved with that skill actually fits into the big picture of their routine. This daily life matrix is created with the parent. This is how they see what they want their child to be doing, not what the child can actually do in the moment. But this gives the parent a way to really grasp what is happening, manage their vulnerability, and at the same time get excited for having ABA treatment start. But even when we ask the parents, well, what does the routine look like for you? Well, they have a really hard time filling out this matrix with the behavior analyst, because they haven't really thought about what their life would look like if there were actually established routines throughout the day. We all have routines because it's a way that we organize our life. So I took the mealtime at breakfast and I broke that down. And these are on the left side, the different types of skills and concepts that this particular child who's 5 years old would need to learn, and what the parent pointed out was important to them. You might add more to that depending on other things that you observe in the assessment, and then you will develop an individual matrix specific to what you would actually be teaching the child in the first 3 to 6 months of intervention. And then concurrent to that are the communication skills that you'll be focusing on that are interrelated to the actual breakfast activity. So when you plan and start ABA treatment, the stimulus conditions are identified, programmed, and the targets are initially on acquisition. And you want to be, and in that process, you want to adequately teach the generalized behavior change expected, concurrent with other skills that you are asking the child to do and perform during your training intervention. Now, the way that you want to be able to visualize that for the parent in order for them to manage their anxiety is you want to be able to point out that we're starting off with the child getting his needs or wants met, because speaking of the child being vulnerable, when the child cannot get his or her needs wants met, they go into behavior problems. And what you want to be able to do is train the child to ask for what he wants based off of the establishing operation that's present, or the conditional state of deprivation or aversion, And you want to be able to then, as a child learns how to man, add to the man a carrier phrase, please, because that creates a better connection for the parent, because a lot of times parents are busy, they're doing things, they're working with their other children in the home, they're on the phone, they're getting ready to leave as well. And oftentimes we don't want to encourage our children to be demanding, although I think a child who's very persistent about their mans, that would be a really new thing for a parent, and they would actually be excited if their child with autism was actually doing that. But when we look at the conditions for asking for juice, it may be during breakfast, it may be during lunch, it may be during snack time, conditions in which a child may say, please. So even though we know these are all types of skills or language skills that the child needs to acquire, we also have conditions, or parents have conditions in which they want the child to make those demands. And that's where we begin to train the carrier phrase, please, and expand on that man with respect to the length of the mean utterance of that particular man. We want to do it in condition, get the child to be able to say please and wait when he is asking for juice and the teacher is busy. Another child is being poured juice when the teacher says, who can show me good manners, because everyone is asking all at the same time. So these are just things that are involved in the generalization process. These are things that parents want their child to be able to do, but can't imagine their child being able to do. And that in itself can create vulnerable thoughts, feelings, and emotions. We would take the individual concepts, skills, language in the form of verbal operants, and we would teach that with respect to stimulus control, stimulus generalization, and across settings and times with respect to names and persistence in levels 1 through 3. I just wanted to give you an idea about what that looks like. What's important here is that the parent's vulnerability starts high and varies, and it's high again when training moves to level 3, because when we get to maintenance and persistence, this is where we begin to see kind of some holes in our intervention. The child isn't maintaining the skill, they're not being persistent, and that creates a situation for the parent to think, oh my God, my child isn't learning anymore. When actually what you're doing is you're teaching for generalization in a broader context, and the child's rate of acquisition appears to be slowing down. The vulnerability even gets greater when we look at levels 4 and 5, generalization to the natural environment, generalization to the verbal social community. There's a lot going on. The situations are very complex. They're competing with schedules. We want the child to transition from an activity to breakfast or lunch or dinner. It's difficult to get the child to stop what they're doing. If they're engaged in a tantrum behavior, they still need to go to breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And at the same time, we want the child to be able to generalize their good manners and their eating time routine at dinner time. They are eating with family. They may be having a snack with a friend. The focus for teaching these skills in the natural environment, to teach for generalization, is bridging those master concept skills in a way that mediates generalization. And the parents feel very vulnerable. It will vary, it will be high, it will be low. In level 5, this is where the judgment jury comes out again. The parent's vulnerability is very high because, oh my God, we're out in public. Everybody's watching, everybody's looking. My kid's not doing this. We rely on the parent to implement the consequences to get the behavior change. The child needs to be able to adapt and be able to display the behavior that is required based off the type of consequence that is given by the parent. A lot of times when we get parents involved in this process, they're not used to having to be the sole person giving the social consequence. But in order to get the type of generalization that you want in the actual verbal community, it requires that the child be able to adapt the behavior based off the parent's look on her face, based off the rules that are established by the parent, based off the societal norms that are expected with how a person behaves in a restaurant. All this requires that the child has learned good manners. But most important, when do we want good manners to be present? When other people are around and not just family members. So we want to be mindful of the thoughts and feelings of the parent's vulnerability and what they're feeling. They're feeling scared. And even though you've worked on social skills, we haven't worked on them from this broader perspective. So it does require for us to be able to break that down in a way that's useful and effective for the parent to be able to see that progress, for them to be able to manage their vulnerability. In summary, when we look at vulnerability, ABA treatment, and parent training, practitioners need to look at parent education in a way where they embrace vulnerability and provide services wholeheartedly. If we ignore the vulnerability, we close ourselves off to that compassionate, empathetic interaction with a parent. Therefore, again, more subtle, we don't give parents permission to then be able to embrace their own vulnerability when they're feeling it with their child and trying to make a connection. The generality of parent skills is required if we want to be successful with ABA treatment. A lot of times we lose the parent in this process. Part of it has to do with not understanding or facilitating the vulnerable feelings that are occurring and ebbing and flowing. And the focus of intervention hasn't been on positive interactions with their child. So in other words, you can be working on behavior problems, you can be working on creating or providing educational training on how to teach a skill to their child. But if the number of positive interactions between the parent and the child does not increase, then the parent is not going to find the behavior education training useful. There was a study done on that by Evelyn Good, published in 2020 when she was looking at certain aspects of ACT with respect to parent training. And that was one of the things that she pointed out in her study. We also want to understand that societal expectations will make parents' vulnerability high. When the child is making demands, vulnerability will be high. Parents managing their own thoughts and emotions of embarrassment, vulnerability will be high. But again, it's not going to come out in the way that the parent says, I just want to let you know I'm feeling very vulnerable. They're going to say things, do things, react to things in ways that are going to make you feel vulnerable. And what typically happens in those situations is you'll feel defensive, or you'll just redirect the situation to something different, or you'll be frustrated and tell your supervisor, you know, this parent is just isn't compliant. We become the compliance police. We must be able to talk about these thoughts and feelings when they exist by just simply saying to, again, you must be having a really tough day. How can I be helpful in that process to you while still trying to work with you and your child? That might just be a very hands-on day. You forget whatever you had on the training material, set it aside. You're not going to talk about one more thing academically. You are going to sit down with a parent and you're saying, I know that you can do this. You're going to have the courage to lean in so that the parent has the courage to lean in and actually do what it is that you're asking. Talking about what they're doing, you talking about what you're doing is not enough. Leaning in, getting into it, getting messy with the parent, with the child, hands-on. That's what you do as practitioners. That's what separates us from academics. We get in, we work with the parent, we work with the child, we provide prompts, we do whatever is necessary so that the parent can be successful in the interaction of what we're teaching the parent. When they see that, you have connection. You bring meaning to their life. You bring success. You empower them through the knowledge and skills and choices that they now can make. The parents are now able to embrace what is happening, and they're able to generalize their skills that you have facilitated through that process into the community, in restaurants, with friends, at home, extracurricular activities that their child was not able to participate in before. What I don't want you to get caught up in is that it doesn't matter the functioning level of the child. They can participate in these areas of everyday life in a meaningful, connective way. if we're able to embrace the vulnerability that is happening, lean in and have the courage to work through it. So I'm done with the presentation, and I will open it up to questions if anybody has anything.
Thanks so much.
Question is, have you had hard cases you just taken on which the parent has already had a couple years of bad experience with ABA and haven't gotten any parent training, and then all of a sudden starting parent training then becomes traumatic? Yes, I actually have had that happen. Now, when a parent is expressing that, or you see that it's been traumatic, one of the ways that you can make a connection with the parent is just to talk to them about what they're experiencing. I see that what I'm asking you to do is creating some anxiety and tension. What's your expectations, or what are you thinking may be occurring during the parent training process? I'd like to be able to provide that information to you in order for you to benefit from what I will be training. We will be breaking it down in a way that is useful to you, that is specific to your child. What are some things that you believe outside of ABA treatment would be helpful in you interacting with your child? I would come in at the angle of where the parent's at, and then fit the parent education training in a way that is useful for what is happening to the parent at the moment. Sometimes with those parents, I just say, hey, we all know that reinforcement, you've seen that occur with your child when intervention is actually occurring with your child, but how could that reinforcement be useful to you? I would focus simply on, forget the academic part, the behavior principles for the moment, just focus on getting some positive interactions with the parent. And this is where it's useful for you to be interactive with the parent to actually demonstrate some of the things that you would be having them do during the parent training process. Hands-on can actually really help a parent shift what is going on with them and their vulnerability when they actually see what is happening, and you involve them in the process with respect to those interactions. And then you can start with the parent education. Well, I want to let you know where this came from. When we are able to teach you about these principles in relationship to how you can use them with your child to get behavior change, then oftentimes parents will be able to make that shift. We have another question with respect to
Brenda, do you want me to just read it to you?
Yeah, you can read it.
Is that easier? Okay. So since we have a pretty limited time during assessments, are there any tips on establishing connection and getting to what's meaningful for parents to have goals that they value? I often get parents just saying he just needs to talk, even though there are a lot of other deficits and barriers, and don't really know what they want to work on with their child.
Now, when a parent is saying, I just want him to not talk, I would interpret that as they want to be able to connect, to be able to know what their child is feeling. They want to know what he wants. They want to be able to interact and play with him. If you just say, so in other words, when you say, I just want my child to talk, this is what you're really saying to me. And bring out what they're feeling in that process. When the parent acknowledges what you're saying, that's the connection. That's what you capitalize on. You say, okay, now that we've brought that to the forefront, wow, of course you want to have a meaningful exchange with your child. That is an absolute, thank you for sharing that with me. I'd like to talk to you now about how that actually looks in the big picture of things, because talking is something that develops with all children. The child is actually at the mercy of you as the caretaker until they can actually be able to do some type of talking. And at least minimally from this perspective, I would just do a lesson on manning. You can teach a child a man within minutes. We did that in front of a whole audience in China, and they had picked a child. Now, granted, you'll have behavior problems, but the one verbal operant that we have been so successful with any child, irrespective of their functioning level, is the man. Once we can get that displayed and get the parent involved with the manding process, things begin to change. And then
okay, then a next question, how can this be applied in a school setting?
Okay. I'm going to assume that you are working with teachers. Now, I can't imagine another population that has a lot of vulnerability going on. You must keep in mind that the child is considered a disruption. The reason why you're going in there and doing ABA services is to provide relief for the teacher. So what I would do is look, it's very helpful that you put the classroom schedule into a matrix for a school setting so that you can understand on an ongoing basis or the big picture basis what that parent, what that teacher actually competes with, what's expected with respect to rules, and then be able to relate what it is that you're doing with the child. Because I don't know to what degree that you're actually doing this. I don't know if you're working with teachers and teaching them how to work with kids with autism. But a lot of times when I look at the matrices, even though I started to develop that for just the home environment, we worked with a lot of school kids. We have a school ourselves. And I call it the classroom matrix. And we begin to then evaluate what is valuable to, or what values the parent hold, the teacher holds that are important to them, and ways that they can interact with the child or the students interactively. And you could say, what's the most important thing that you want your students to be able to do? We start with that process. What's the highest barrier that you compete with? And oftentimes it really, as simple as this sounds, we underestimate the importance of reinforcement and understanding the principle of reinforcement to increase these positive interactions. They're used to getting an academic definition, or I know, and everybody knows what reinforcement is. And most of the time, they might be able to give you definition. Oftentimes it's described as bribery, or they're so dependent on reinforcement, they don't know how to fade it and actually create that meaningful interaction. So these are things that you want to be able to discuss and have teachers participate in that process as well.
All right. And Brenda, our last question, what, if any, difficulties have you experienced with clients who live across two different households? Barriers in training, contingencies across caregivers often occur. Would you suggest focusing on one household first?
Okay, that's going to depend on whether you have the luxury of only training one parent in that household. Oftentimes when we are doing intervention at this intensity level, we are required to work with both households. So you need to create a home matrix for both households. Find out what the parents expect, what they want the child to be able to do. Again, this is not what the child is actually able to do. This is what they want the child to be doing in a way that you can visually see the process. So each routine, the routines in each household for the morning routine, the afternoon, and the evening, and going to bed can look different. And if you have a matrix, home matrices filled out for both households, you can begin to look at what they have in common. Then you can begin to start your intervention from that common ground, as opposed to trying to compete with all the challenges, all the vulnerability that's just in your face, and you are just feeling completely, totally scattered. Remember that you are the driver of the ABA program, and therefore you can help decide with all the people that you're working with that for the self-interest of the child to be able to make a meaningful connection with your child, we're going to start here. So manding is something that can occur in both households. You can agree on a specific skill that the child needs to teach. Now, the reason why I didn't focus this particular training on behavior problems, I wanted to start with a place where the vulnerability is not super high. When we put the parents in a position of teaching skills, teaching mands, and getting that interactive process going, then the parents can see their own successes with their child. And it's not that you won't address behavior problems, but you just don't want to start there, because you're going to get, and I want to be really clear on this, vulnerability is not opening up opportunity for someone to spill out their whole life history. Vulnerability is embracing what is happening and saying, wow, you must be exhausted, or you're overwhelmed. Do you ever take a break for yourself? And the parent says, I didn't, no, never. Maybe just creating space for that, for the parent just to take 5 minutes just to breathe, because the behavioral problems are so high. They forgot how to do all that because they're inundated with all their vulnerability at its highest level, because they're still trying to meet the everyday needs of their child that they're working with. So we have to find some common ground in both those households where both the parents and the child benefit, and they can see that interactive, meaningful process.
Awesome. And I just wanted to read a few of the comments, Brenda, because you might not have seen them, but it says, thank you so much. You've put so much work into this. It's so appreciative, great information. Thank you. Thank you so much. Very informative, really appreciate. Thank you for recording this. And then there was one over here that said, this was wonderful, very helpful. So we have a lot of good feedback here, very appropriate for working with teachers and staff, and a lot of thank yous. So thank you guys for commenting and for participating. I know that word waterfall was, it was hard to keep up with all of the answers that were given. But you know, the topic is quite important, and Brenda's really touched on a lot. So we encourage you to check out the ABA Tech CEU. It's a lot of information, and it's a 27.5 unit course that you have a long time to be able to access, which is great. Check out Brenda's book, and you know, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions at all. If you weren't able to ask it, or if your answer wasn't enough.
And if you would like more training in this area with different other aspects of a child's ABA program, feel free to comment about that or make suggestions of other areas that you could see. I certainly would be willing to talk about vulnerability when it comes to managing behavior problems. That'd probably be like a 3-part series, but it is different than what I presented here, even though the topic is the same. So just think of other areas where vulnerability can really show up and either embrace it or become a barrier.
When parents are overwhelmed, vulnerable, stressed out, when you say lean in, get messy, do you mean just talk to the parents? And what do we talk about?
If that's all happening like in one session, this is where ACT becomes very helpful. You want to get the parent in the present moment. One of the ways that you get the parent in the present moment is to say, I really feel your frustration. I really feel your vulnerability and overwhelmness. Just getting them to sit with it. Just say, okay, now what I want you to do is just sit with that. And what I hear you telling me is that, so because I don't know what the assignment is, I don't know the context in which that has happened, but one of the examples that I was given was that their child was toilet trained, and then all of a sudden they started having accidents. So usually it's typical that there's a regression that's happening with their child. They may be competing with things in the household because there's other siblings that live there that they have to attend to. I don't know the exact context, but getting the parent just to sit with that and saying, okay, now we're going to work through this. We want to find successes that you can have with your child. That allows you to maintain the connection because you heard the parent. You let the parent know that you see him, that you hear him, and that staying in the present moment. Because usually when feelings of emotions are that high, they're thinking of the past, they're thinking of the future. You could even be saying, what are you thinking in the moment right now? What's at the very forefront? And then you say, and then they'll tell you. And somewhere when I say lean in, okay, you say, now, what if I told you that every parent feels that way? What if I told you that those feelings are what everybody feels when competing with so many things? Today, let's just focus on something that you're going to find useful to be able to embrace those feelings and thoughts that you're having. And then based off what the parent says to you, again, don't have an agenda that's so tight and be so into, oh my God, they're not complying to what I asked them to do or getting things done. Be open and flexible with what you're assigning them. We're behavior analysts. We're trained to analyze competing environmental contingencies. And therefore, because we have that ability, we're also able to break down behaviors we want the parent to do in a way that's successful for them. It may not have been the type of day that you wanted, but for that day, that's what you do, because you have to continue to build trust with a parent. If you blow it off, if you get exasperated, now it's one thing if they act out and take it out on you, just say, wow, it sounds like today's just probably not a good day to have this session. A lot of times we're also in the business of needing to set a boundary. And so if you don't make those boundaries really clear, I tell parents right up front, I'm not a therapist. I'm not your therapist, but I am here to work with you and your family to create meaningful interactions between you and your child. You're going to have days where some of the things I'm asking you to do aren't going to be enough. And if you begin to see that that's what's happening more often than what you're actually able to teach them, parents don't even know how to ask for help for themselves. Do they have a support system? Do they have somebody that they can talk to? So there could be other things that might be going on with the family at the same time.